Okay. Oops. Please subscribe to help you and your motorcycle perform better. All right, so frozen wheel bearing is not going anywhere. So these have to come out. So the next thing now is to feel the bearing itself. There's no side play backwards and forwards this direction. And it's solid and seated on the side. No crusty, no lumpy. Okay, so that looks like that bearing's just fine. If you're going to pull the wheel bearings, then I would recommend that you take both rotors off. Why? Well, do I want to put a piece of wood here and then leverage on this against the carrier to get the dust seal out? Many of you might go, what's the matter with you? Don't be so soft, get it done. Others will be very particular because it is your motorcycle. In my case, if I'm doing bearings, the rotors have to go. You choose, do it whichever way you want. Let's warm everything up. Bit more gas.
It's a little chilly in the shop.
There we go. Now, we don't want to set the rubber on fire, so we're going to heat around the actual area that the rotor bolts into. If the grease is all melted into the center of the hub, then it's going to smoke. That's to be expected. And it is cold in here, so this is going to take a minute. Let's see if that'll pop off. Now we're going to use a piece of wood and the screwdriver so we don't mar the hub. Nope. Okay. Now we're going to keep going and get this really toasty. Not boiling hot, not melting, but we're going to get this really hot because the warmer it is, the easier the bearing comes out. And because it's so cold and the metal's so cold, it's going to take a while. This is the tool we're going to insert, which is the correct diameter for the wheel bearing. On the flat inside, we're going to drive the stake into this, and it will flare it out, which will grip that bearing. First thing to do is insert, turn over. Now we've got to look down inside and find the slot and get this centered. There. Now we'll go ahead and tap that in place. We'll bring our blocks back, seat it correctly. There we go. Now we've got to just tap carefully If it's hot enough and we put the stake far enough in, it's flared enough to grip the bearing. Okay. Oops. So this wasn't flared enough to grip it, it just tapped it all the way through and out. So the next thing we've got to do is get this off of this, heat this up a little more so it expands more, use the propane, warm it up, put it back in and try again. When you've got this type of bearing puller, it is 100% depending on this gripping the inside of the race. There we go. Now the other part is obviously the wheel wasn't hot enough and the bearing was pretty well locked in there. So we got to heat it up and start over and do it again. Don't get frustrated by the process, especially if you're working in a really cold place. It's much nicer to have a really warm room to be able to get the bearings out because it makes the job much more easy. Now do this really gently because remember you got to put this in. So you don't want to burn your hands, you just want to warm this up. So don't go bonkers on this. It just needs a little heat. Good. Nice tight fit. Centered. Okay. That's good. We're centered. Now let's hope it grips this time. Nope. Try again. We've got the bearing is slightly off straight, so we've got that is deep and this side is less deep, so the bearing's slightly sideways, which is a problem. So the question is, can we straighten it out a little bit while it's nice and hot and level it? That's better. Yep, now let's try again. Let's check it for warmth. It's cold again. All right, more heat. First one was probably a couple of minutes. Second one was definitely a good 2 minutes. So we'll see what we get. We've got some heat still in there. It's still warm, but it's not hot. So we know we're getting close with heat when we apply the heat. Now we've got grease that's coming out from the actual bearing itself between the plastic protection cover so we don't want to get too hot. There it goes. That should be hot enough now to go ahead and get it out. All right, attempt number 3. Yes! Woo! Now obviously when you pull one bearing out, your center spacer that sits against the inner race is going to go with it. So don't be surprised that this comes out. That's perfectly normal. Now the next piece is to get the wheel ready for the other side. The other thing to look at is On the inside, we're going to clean this surface perfectly and make it really clean. But the bearing that we had on the inside, you can see has no plastic, has no cover on it at all. None. When you look at the inside, there's just barely a lip here, barely, just to retain the outer race and hold it in place. So because of this machined lip, it's not in diameter thick enough to cover the open side of the bearing. So guess where all the grease goes? It just goes away. So as the wheel's turning, working, getting hot, the grease is melting, and then it's just going to spin around in here. And you can see there's lots of grease inside there too. So one of the reasons again why we clean, grease wheel bearings fairly often. So the heat put grease back in, so now, whoops, now the bearing moves just fine. Bearing number 2, cross your fingers.
Cha-ching!
Ta-da!
You are the wiener.
Like anything else, lessons learned, right? Do this carefully, do that, now go to this, now go to this long, now do this much heat. Go the other side, you know what to do, so it should work much easier. The other part that makes it simpler on this side is you can see all the way down the hub of the wheel, and you can get the stake perfectly centered. And because of that, that should make the bearing extraction much easier because the flange opens evenly on both sides. So apply the lessons learned, and the job gets done faster. And of course, the bearing spins freely now. Now that the bearings are out, we need to clean the surfaces and get them pristine and prepared. Everybody will have their cleaning solution, their cleaning solution that they want to use. Whichever way they want to get this done. Honor your system, how you will do it. I am going to just wipe it out, get it really clean with the rag to make sure. Then I'll use a little bit of brake clean on the surface to make sure that at that point it's contaminant free, including and most importantly on the seating face on both sides. So how you want to do it's up to you, but make sure you get it clean. Now we've got 2 sizes of socket here because I don't have drivers for the bearing, so I'm making the best of the situation I have. The first one is almost as wide as the wheel. So as the bearing gets tapped in, this catches the outside race. It's plenty thick enough here, and just gently works the race into place. Then, once the race is flush, we go ahead and use the smaller socket to just go ahead and tap that in and make that seat. Now, I always grease the inner race. Doesn't need a ton, just needs to be light, and that eases the bearing going in. On the first bearing that goes down, we want to seat it against our platform here that's machined out so that it is down and flat. Before we put the bearing in, they've been in the freezer for a week. This should be hot and wider. The new bearing going in should be cold and as constricted as possible because it's frozen. And again, we're just going to warm the hub. We're not going to put the flame inside. Very cold, very ready. The good news is sealed, sealed.
Both sides.
So, greater longevity. Is that warm enough? No, it's not. Will that come back out? Probably not. No. Okay. Well, let's give it a quick go and see if it'll seat. side. Still high. Okay, let's warm it up again. Now with the new bearing, we don't want to get it so hot that the grease bubbles. So we got to warm it up just enough so that the bearing will slide in. So that really loud last tap means it's bottomed out. So this side is done. While it's nice and toasty and warm, go ahead and set your dust seal in. Again, you just want a tiny bit of grease on the outside to seat it, and that way it makes it easier to remove if you ever get back to that point again. So that sits in. And then we'll just gently tap that flat. A little bit more. Seated all the way around. Okay. Now the additional challenge is this has to go in, it has to sit flat, and then when the new bearing comes in, it's got to sit perfectly flat on this too. So this may not perfectly seat on that ridge because of the height of the spacer. So you can see the spacer's proud. So the difficult part now is getting that perfectly centered while you're trying to seat the bearing. So you go so far, reposition this, tap a little more, reposition it, tap a little more until they make contact. And that is as deep as it can go, and it should coincide with the ridge. So this side's a lot more difficult. You've got to be a lot more patient with it, because if you smash this down and trap that cockeyed, now you got to start all over again, pull this one out, or at least drive it away from the spacer and then heat it up and go again. So be patient. Okay. So now that that is flush, we're going to make sure the space is still loose, which it is. Now we've got to carefully bring this down. Check your spacer, still loose. Now I can hear it hit and tap. Yeah, it's catching. So let's make sure that's centered. There we go. Check again. That feels pretty good. Still there. Okay. All right, so that's seated. So the last piece is to go ahead and put the dust seal in. We're good to go. So while it felt okay on the other end, we come back to this side and it's actually locked. The spacer kicked off at the last second. So I've got to pop that bearing down just a hair to free the spacer up, and that'll be enough. Let's go ahead and do that. The spacer is not free. Now it should be. Is the bearing moving? No, see the bearing, the pull is coming out. It's not moving the bearing. Okay. So we'll start over. There it goes. So now the space is free. Where we could clearly see it last time, just that one tap freed it up enough. So now the trick is to get this out. We've got to go back to this side. Now we've got to go ahead and try and tap this down gently. It's still warm, so not quite so hard this time. There, perfect. Yep. So lined up, lined up. So now we just got to put the dust seal in. Our new bearings are installed. The best part is they're protected on both sides with the plastic covers to keep the grease in as much as possible, which will give us much greater longevity on the bearing.
Dave Moss can tune your suspension no matter where you are on the planet via his remote tuning service. Contact Dave on Facebook or by email, dave@davemosstuning.com.